The gun was already drawn when Peter Malone realized he was pointing it at the wrong person. He stood in the middle of Caldwell Street, the main artery of Harlow Creek, Nevada, with the morning sun barely cresting the eastern ridge and painting the dust a violent shade of copper. His hand was steady. It was always steady, had been for 11 years, but his chest was doing something it had never done before in all his time wearing that star. It was collapsing inward, folding like wet paper, and the reason for it was standing 10 feet away from him with a carpet bag in one hand and the most devastating pair of gray eyes he had ever seen in his life. "Sheriff," the woman said, and her voice did not shake, not even slightly. "If you are going to shoot me, I would appreciate knowing why first." Peter Malone had kept order in Harlow Creek for 11 years. He had faced down cattle rustlers, bank robbers, a man who had once thrown a lit dynamite stick through the window of the postal office, and a drought so severe it had nearly torn the town's spirit in half. He had done all of it without losing so much as a single night of sleep. He had lost it all completely the morning she arrived, because he had not drawn the gun on her. He had drawn it on the man standing behind her, Clarence Webb, the most powerful land baron in the Nevada Territory, a man with a smile like a rusted trap and secrets buried so deep they had their own roots. And Webb had used that exact moment of distraction, the moment Evelyn Norris had stepped off the morning stage and walked directly into the crossfire, to slip sideways behind the covered water trough and disappear like smoke. Peter lowered the Colt. His jaw was tight enough to crack stone. "You stepped into a situation that was not yours to step into," he said. "And yet," she said, setting her carpet bag down with a deliberateness that suggested she intended to stay, "here we both are." She looked at him the way a person looks at something they are trying to understand from every angle simultaneously, measuring, cataloging, deciding. He felt the strangest sensation that she had already determined something about him that he had not yet determined about himself. Webb was gone. 3 months of careful, painstaking work, and Webb was gone because this woman in the sensible gray traveling dress had walked off a stagecoach at precisely the wrong moment and made Peter's gun hand waver for the first time in his adult life. He picked up her carpet bag before she could protest and turned toward the sheriff's office. "You had better come explain yourself," he said. She followed without argument, which told him 2 things immediately. She was not afraid of him, and she had come here with a purpose. Both of those things, he would later understand, were the most dangerous combination he had ever encountered. Now let the story begin from 3 days before that morning, when the letter first arrived, and let it unspool to its ending with everything that mattered laid bare between them. 3 days before Evelyn Norris stepped off the stage and shattered 11 years of hard-won composure, Peter Malone had been sitting in his office at the edge of a problem that had no clean solution. It was a Thursday in the spring of 1883, and Harlow Creek sat in the high desert of Nevada like a stubborn seed that had refused to stop growing. The town had started as a mining camp 20 years back, had absorbed the silver rush and the collapse of the silver rush, and had come through it all with a general store, a hotel called the Larkspur, a saloon called the Dusty Boot, a church that the Reverend was still paying off, a schoolhouse, a telegraph office, and roughly 460 souls who mostly kept to themselves and mostly kept the peace. Mostly because of Peter Malone. He was 34 years old, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that had begun collecting the first gray threads at the temples, and a face that had been weathered by sun and worry into something people often described as serious. He was not a man given to unnecessary speech or unnecessary movement. He had learned early that economy of action kept you alive in the territory, and he had built his entire life around that principle. What he had not built into his life was any provision for what a woman like Evelyn Norris could do to it. The letter on his desk had come from the territorial marshal's office in Carson City. It was brief, and it was alarming in the way that only truly important letters manage to be, not through dramatic language, but through the cold precision of its facts. Clarence Webb, it said, had been systematically acquiring deeds to properties throughout the territory using fraudulent documentation, forged signatures, intimidated witnesses. In at least 2 cases, the deaths of the property owners had been ruled accidents that the marshal's office now believed were not accidents at all. The marshal needed Peter to compile a full accounting of Webb's land holdings in the Harlow Creek area, and to do so quietly, without tipping Webb to the investigation. The last line of the letter read, "A witness from Reno will be arriving on the Friday morning stage. Her name is Evelyn Norris. She carries evidence that will be central to the prosecution. Keep her safe." Peter had read that line 4 times. Then he had folded the letter and locked it in his desk drawer and gone to look out his office window at the street, where Clarence Webb was at that very moment shaking hands with the mayor in front of the bank. Webb was 45, silver-haired, and wore his money the way some men wore a weapon conspicuously, as a warning. He had arrived in Harlow Creek 2 years ago with capital and ambition, and had inserted himself into the town's economy with surgical precision. He owned the mill. He owned the largest cattle ranch in the valley. He sat on the town council. He smiled at everyone, and the smile never reached his eyes, and yet people kept shaking his hand because prosperity has its own kind of gravity that is very hard to resist. Peter had disliked Webb from the first day and had never found a legitimate reason to do more than dislike him. Now he had one, and a witness was coming on the Friday stage. He spent Thursday quietly, moving through his rounds the way he always did, stopping at the general store where old Thomas Briggs was reorganizing his tobacco tins, passing the schoolhouse where he could hear the children reciting their multiplication tables, nodding to the women hanging laundry behind the larkspur. He noted Webb's movements without appearing to note them. Webb spent Thursday in visible prosperity, at the bank in the morning, at the town council chambers in the afternoon, at the Dusty Boot in the evening, where he drank 1 whiskey and played 1 hand of cards and left at a respectable hour, as if he had scripted himself into the role of the town's most upstanding citizen. Peter went home to his small house at the north end of town and sat on the porch for a long time in the dark, listening to the desert breathe. He had come to Harlow Creek at 23, raw from a failed attempt at gold prospecting up north, and carrying nothing but a horse, a gun, and a letter of recommendation from a sheriff in Wyoming who had employed him as a deputy for 8 months. The previous sheriff of Harlow Creek had died of a fever, and the town had been without law for 6 weeks and was showing the fraying edges that come from that absence. Peter had pinned on the badge and simply started working, and somewhere in the first year the town had decided he belonged to it, and somewhere in the second year he had decided the same. He had been engaged once. Her name was Clara, and she had been warm and practical and good, and she had left for Sacramento in 1878 because she had told him, with a gentleness that made it worse, that she could not be the wife of a man whose entire heart belonged to a dusty street in the middle of nowhere. He had not argued with her because she had been entirely right. He had watched the stage carry her away and had felt the grief of it without surprise because he had known, somewhere underneath everything, that he was a man made for this particular place and that the place would always come first. He had not been in love since Clara. He had not permitted himself to be. Order, he had learned, requires sacrifice, and the sacrifice he had made was the softness of a personal life. He had his rounds. He had his duty. He had 11 years of peace in a town that had needed it badly. All of that, he reflected on his dark porch, was about to get complicated. He was right about that. He simply had no idea how completely. Friday morning arrived with the particular clarity that high desert mornings have, the air so clean it almost stung, the sky a shade of blue that seemed too saturated to be real. Peter was on the street by 7, having had 3 cups of coffee and approximately 4 hours of sleep. He had positioned himself near the stage stop at the edge of Caldwell Street in a way that appeared casual and was not at all casual. What he had not accounted for was Clarence Webb also being on the street. Webb was standing outside the bank when the stage rolled in, and Peter saw the man's gaze fix on the door of the coach with an attention that was too sharp, too focused, too prepared. Someone had told Webb. Someone in Carson City, or someone along the route, had told Clarence Webb that a witness was arriving on the Friday morning stage. The trap was already set. Peter had moved immediately, cutting across the street with his hand on his gun, and then the coach door had opened and she had stepped down. Evelyn Norris. Even in that first fraught second, with his attention split between Webb and the crowd and the awareness that something was about to go violently wrong, Peter had registered her with a clarity that felt almost inappropriate to the urgency of the moment. She was perhaps 28, with dark brown hair pinned severely under a gray traveling hat, and those eyes pale gray, the color of morning light on still water, that swept the street with a quick, intelligent assessment that told him immediately she was not a fragile woman. She carried the carpet bag in one hand and something else in the other, a small satchel pressed against her side with the particular firmness of someone protecting something important. The evidence. She was carrying it herself. Webb had moved from the bank doorway, and Peter had drawn his gun, and then she had stepped directly into the space between them, either because she had not seen the trajectory of the confrontation, or because she had calculated something he could not yet understand, and Webb had used that exact second to vanish, and there they had stood. Now Peter dropped into the chair behind his desk and watched her take the seat across from him with the composure of someone who had been in difficult rooms before. "You are Evelyn Norris," he said. "I am," she said. "And you are Sheriff Peter Malone. The marshal's office gave me a description." "What description?" "Tall, dark hair, the expression of a man perpetually disappointed by the behavior of the world." A pause. It was accurate. Peter looked at her for a long moment. "Webb saw you get off that stage. Someone told him you were coming." She nodded, and something moved behind her eyes, not fear exactly, but a tight, controlled acknowledgement of danger that he recognized because he had felt it himself many times. "I know. It happened in Reno as well. Someone has been feeding information about my movements to Webb's people since before I left." "You still came." "I still came," she confirmed. "Most people," Peter said, "would have considered that a sufficient reason not to." "Most people," she said, "did not watch Clarence Webb force my father to sign away his ranch and then arrange for my father to die before he could testify about it." The office went very quiet. Peter put his hands flat on his desk. Everything shifted in that moment, not just the nature of the case, but the stakes of it, the personal weight of it, the reason she was sitting across from him with that terrible steadiness in her gray eyes. "Tell me," he said. She told him. Robert Norris had owned 700 acres outside of Reno, land that had been in the family for 15 years, land that sat directly over a water table that Webb's expanding cattle operation desperately needed access to. Webb had come to Robert Norris with an offer, then with a lower offer, then with a threat that Robert had reported to the local sheriff, who had done nothing. Then the documentation for the land had somehow changed, a deed transfer that Robert swore he had never signed, with a signature that was very nearly but not quite his own. By the time the paperwork had moved through the territorial recorder's office, the land had belonged to one of Webb's subsidiary companies, and Robert Norris had been informed that he was trespassing on his own property. He had died 3 weeks later. His horse had thrown him on a trail he had ridden 500 times without incident. The local sheriff had called it an accident. Evelyn had not called it an accident. Evelyn had spent 2 years assembling the evidence that said it was not. She had the original deed. She had affidavits from 2 witnesses who had seen a man in Webb's employ near the trail on the day of the accident. She had documentation from a land clerk in Reno who had since died of a very convenient illness, but who had told her, before dying, exactly how the forgery system worked, and who had ordered it. All of that was in the satchel she was still holding against her side. "I need somewhere to keep this that Webb cannot reach," she said. "And I need to remain in Harlow Creek long enough for the territorial marshal to arrive. His letter said 2 weeks. Peter looked at her. He looked at the satchel. He looked at the door of his office, through which the street of his town was visible in the bright morning light. 2 weeks, he said. 2 weeks, she confirmed. He nodded once slowly, the way he nodded when he had made a decision that he already knew was going to cost him something significant. "There is a room above the general store. Tom Briggs rents it and he is trustworthy. I will tell him you are a cousin of mine come to visit." She raised an eyebrow. "Your cousin?" Nobody questions a sheriff's family visiting. Can you conduct yourself plausibly as a cousin? "I can conduct myself plausibly as almost anything," she said, and for the first time there was the ghost of something wry in her expression, something that was not quite a smile but was in the vicinity of one. He should have noted that as a warning. He chose to note it as an asset. The satchel went into the locked compartment in the floor of Peter's office, beneath a loose board that only he knew about. Evelyn Norris went to the room above Briggs's general store. And Peter Malone went back to his rounds with the very particular feeling of a man who has just invited a wildfire into his life and told himself it will be contained. The first days were tense in a way that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with survival. Webb had not approached her directly. He was too careful for that. But Peter noticed the way Webb's gaze tracked her whenever she appeared on the street, and he noticed the 2 men who had ridden into town the day after her arrival and taken rooms at the Larkspur. They were not the kind of men who looked like they had come to Harlow Creek for the mineral springs. They were the kind of men who had the patience and the blankness of professional watchers. Peter assigned his deputy, a capable young man named Henry Greer who had been with him for 3 years, to keep unobtrusive eyes on Evelyn's movements. He told Henry only that she was a witness in a territorial case and that she needed quiet protection. Henry, who had an admirable talent for not asking unnecessary questions, accepted this without comment. Evelyn herself proved to be a problem in the best possible sense. She was not a woman who could be still. She did not stay in her room above the general store reading novels. She moved through Harlow Creek with the quiet, purposeful energy of someone cataloging a new environment, visiting the general store below her room, and talking with Tom Briggs about the history of the town, stopping at the schoolhouse to speak with the teacher about whether they needed additional supplies, attending Sunday service at the church, and afterward helping the Reverend's wife arrange the chairs back into their weekday configuration. She was making herself part of the town. And the town, which had a healthy instinct for genuine people, was responding to her warmth with a warmth of its own. Peter watched this with a complicated feeling he could not immediately name. He had told himself she was a witness, a protected person, a responsibility. He had organized his internal relationship to her along those clean, professional lines and had been careful to maintain them. But Harlow Creek was not a large place, and their cover story required them to behave with the easy familiarity of family, which meant they had to be seen together with some regularity, which meant he had to spend time with her. He took his meals at the Larkspur dining room most evenings, and she ate there as well, and they sat across from each other and talked, because a sheriff ignoring his visiting cousin would be more conspicuous than a sheriff talking to her. The first evening, the conversation had been careful and factual, the progress of the case, the movements of Webb's watchers, the timeline for the marshal's arrival. The second evening, she had asked him how he had come to be here, and he had answered more fully than he intended to, telling her about the failed prospecting attempt and the letter of recommendation and the 6 weeks of chaos before he had arrived. She listened with the quality of attention that made the listened-to person feel as though what they were saying was genuinely interesting, and he found himself describing things he had not described to anyone in years. The third evening, she had told him about her father. Not the factual account of the fraud and the death. She had given him that already with her attorney's precision. This was different. She told him about the ranch outside Reno, about the smell of sage in the morning, and the way her father used to sing terribly and unself-consciously while he worked the horses. She told him about how her mother had died when Evelyn was 12, and how her father had raised her to be practical about grief, not because he was cold, but because he had understood that the living had to keep moving. She told him that the 2 years of building her case had been, in a strange way, a form of keeping moving. "You could have let the marshal handle it from the beginning," Peter said. "You did not have to make it your personal mission." "He was my father," she said simply. The fourth evening something shifted. It was nothing dramatic. They were finishing their supper and the dining room was emptying, and the light from the oil lamps had settled into the warm amber that made everything look softer and more true at the same time. She was talking about something the Reverend's wife had said that afternoon, something funny about a misdirected church donation, and she was smiling genuinely for the first time he had seen, not the wry, controlled expression she used in professional conversation, but a real smile, spontaneous and unguarded, and Peter felt it in his sternum like a struck bell. He looked away immediately, looked at his coffee cup, composed himself. When he looked back, she was watching him with that gray-eyed, assessing quality, and he thought she had noticed what had just happened, and the thought produced a wave of something that was equal parts discomfort, and he admitted it privately with great reluctance. "Hope." "How long?" she asked. "Have you been alone here?" He was not prepared for the question. Its directness was disarming in the way that only very honest questions can be. He thought about deflecting. He looked at her face and decided that deflection would be disrespectful to the quality of the question. 11 years, he said. "Give or take." She nodded as if this confirmed something. "The town loves you," she said. "I have heard nothing but Peter Malone this and the sheriff that since I arrived. You have done something genuine here. You should know that." The compliment landed differently than compliments usually did. Usually a compliment from a townsperson felt like an obligation, a recognition of the service he provided, something to be acknowledged and filed away. This felt personal, directed at him specifically, at the man rather than the badge. "You have been asking people about me," he said. "I ask people about everything," she said. "It is how I assembled 2 years' worth of evidence about Clarence Webb. I am constitutionally incapable of not asking questions." He almost smiled. He caught it just barely. Webb made his first direct move on the 6th day. He appeared at Peter's office in the mid-morning with the easy confidence of a man who has decided to manage a situation himself, and he sat in the chair across from the desk, the chair Evelyn had sat in, which Peter noticed and found irritating, and he spoke very pleasantly about nothing important for approximately 5 minutes, and then he said, "I understand you have a cousin visiting." "Word travels in a small town," Peter said. "It does." Webb examined his own hands, which were manicured in the way of a man who had not done actual labor in many years. "What is her business here?" "Family visit," Peter said. "She needed a change of scenery." "From Nevada," Peter said simply. "She has been under some strain. It has been a difficult year for her." Webb looked at him steadily. The pleasant surface of the man's expression had not changed, but something behind it had a density, a calculation, a sense of doors being quietly closed against potential escape. "I hope she finds Harlow Creek restful," he said. "We are a welcoming community. I would very much like to meet her properly. Perhaps you might bring her to the social on Saturday." The social was a monthly gathering at the town hall, music, dancing, the community knitting itself back together after a week of individual labor. It was also, Peter realized, a public venue where Webb could assess Evelyn without arousing suspicion, where his watchers would blend into the crowd, and where any number of things could happen in plain sight that would be very difficult to prevent. "I will mention it to her," Peter said. After Webb left, Peter sat for a long time thinking about the shape of the trap. It was elegant, in a cold way. Webb could not move against her directly without implicating himself. But he could place her in a situation where she might be frightened away, or where evidence could be arranged to discredit her, or where one of the watchers might create an incident that looked like something other than what it was. Peter locked the office and went to find her. She was at the general store helping Tom Briggs inventory his bulk goods, which was exactly the kind of industrious, community-minded activity that had apparently been her constant mode since arrival. She looked up when he entered and read something in his face immediately. "What has happened?" she asked. "Webb came to see me. He wants you at the Saturday social." She was quiet for a moment. Briggs, showing the tact that had kept him a trusted member of the community for 25 years, found something to do at the far end of the store. "Does he know who I am?" she asked. "He suspects. He does not have confirmation." Peter folded his arms. "I do not want you to go." "If I do not go," she said carefully, "it will confirm his suspicion." A woman visiting her cousin who refuses to attend the one significant social event of the month, when everyone else in town will be there, it will read as hiding. He hated that she was right. "If you go," he said, "you will be in a space I cannot fully control." "Sheriff Malone," she said, and there was a gentleness in her voice under the practicality, "I have been in spaces you could not control since I started this. The difference between Harlow Creek and Reno is that here I have someone I trust watching my back." He registered the word trust and filed it somewhere important. "I will be beside you the entire evening," he said. "I know," she said, and turned back to the bulk goods with the serenity of someone who has made a decision and is not going to revisit it. Tom Briggs, at the far end of the store, very carefully did not smile. The Saturday social occupied the town hall from 7 in the evening onward, and Harlow Creek took its monthly socials seriously. The hall was strung with oil lamps and paper lanterns. The fiddler from out near the southern pastures had been brought in along with 2 of his brothers, and the tables along the walls were loaded with the collective baking efforts of approximately 40 women who had been competing with each other in this arena for years. Peter arrived early and stationed himself where he could see every entrance. Evelyn arrived at 7:15 in a dress that was not the gray traveling clothes she had worn every day of the preceding week. It was a deep blue, the color of the sky at the moment before full dark, and she wore it with the same self-possessed quality she wore everything. But there was something different about her tonight. The hair arranged more softly, a small pair of garnet earrings that caught the lamplight when she turned her head. He was aware of the precise moment she entered the room. He was aware of it the way you are aware of a change in atmospheric pressure. He crossed to her immediately and offered his arm, because the cousin arrangement required it and also because he wanted to and had decided to stop pretending he did not. "You look well," he said. "You look alarmed," she said, taking his arm. "I am always alarmed in spaces I cannot control." "Yes," she said, "but tonight you look alarmed in a suit." He had put on the good jacket that spent most of the year on its hook. He was not going to address this. They moved through the room together, and Peter was hyper-attentive to everything to Webb, who arrived at 7:30 with his usual smooth ease, and surveyed the room with those dead-end eyes before finding them and nodding with terrible pleasantness. To the 2 watchers, who were indeed present, on opposite sides of the room, not dancing, nursing drinks with the focused idleness of men on assignment. To Henry Greer, who was also present and had understood without being told to make himself visible near the exits. Evelyn, for her part, was extraordinary. She spoke to people with genuine interest and remembered details from previous conversations, asking the Reverend's wife about the resolution of the misdirected donation situation, complimenting the teacher on a drawing one of the children had apparently shown her that week, laughing at something Tom Briggs said about his inventory that Peter could not quite hear from where he was standing. She was real in a way that could not be manufactured. The town felt it. People were drawn to her the way people are drawn to genuineness when they encounter it, which is to say helplessly and completely. Webb made his approach at 8 o'clock. He was everything Peter had expected him to be: charming, surface gracious, the smile deployed like a precision instrument. He asked Evelyn about herself with the skill of a man who knew how to make questions sound like interest rather than interrogation. She answered with the skill of a woman who had spent 2 years anticipating exactly this kind of conversation. "And what is it you do in Reno, Miss Norris?" Webb asked. "Reading and correspondence mostly," she said pleasantly. "I assist with legal documentation for a land attorney's office. Very quiet work." Something moved in Webb's eyes. The word legal had landed like a pebble on glass. The crack was invisible, but it was there. "How industrious," he said. "My father taught me the value of knowing how documents work," she said, and smiled at Webb with a sweetness that Peter recognized as the most dangerous thing she had said all evening. He always said that a document can either protect you or bury you, and it is worth knowing which one you are looking at. Webb held her gaze for 1 second too long. "Your father sounds like a wise man." "He was," she said. "He is greatly missed." Webb excused himself shortly after. Peter watched him go and felt the specific tension of a man who has just watched someone walk into a trap and spring it without flinching and walk out the other side. "That was reckless," he said quietly. "That was strategic," she said. "He needed to know that I know what I know so that he understands there is no version of this where the evidence disappears with me. If he had any thought that removing me would resolve his problem, I have just made clear that the knowledge is already out." Peter looked at her. "You are not afraid of him at all." "I am terrified of him," she said simply. "But being afraid and being stopped are two different things." He did not know what to do with her. He had never in his adult life not known what to do with a situation. And this situation, this person, had him completely without a reliable map. The fiddler started a waltz, and around them couples moved onto the cleared floor. And in the lamplight of the Harlow Creek Town Hall on a Saturday evening in 1883, Peter Malone made a decision that had nothing to do with order or duty and everything to do with the fact that he had been alone for 11 years, and he was tired of it in a way he had not known until this moment. "Would you dance with me?" he asked. She looked at him for a moment with those gray eyes that saw too much. "We are supposed to be cousins," she said. "Cousins can dance." A pause, then, "Yes," she said, "they can." She fit against him with a naturalness that was so unexpected he had to make a conscious effort not to stop moving. They were the same height, nearly. She was tall, and she danced well, with the economy of someone who had learned it properly and then put it away for practical reasons, and was now remembering it with a kind of wistfulness. He could feel the warmth of her hand through his jacket sleeve and the slight pressure of her palm against his, and the fact that she did not hold herself at a careful distance the way some women did when dancing with someone they were cautious about. "Peter," she said, and the use of his first name stopped his breath for a second. "Yes." "When this is over," she started again. "After the marshal comes and the case is complete, what happens to you?" "I go back to being the sheriff of Harlow Creek," he said. "And that is enough for you." He thought about the porch in the dark, listening to the desert. He thought about 11 years of eating alone. He thought about the particular quality of the room when she was in it versus when she was not. "I thought it was," he said. She did not say anything to that. But she moved, barely perceptibly, a fraction of an inch closer to him, and they finished the dance without speaking. And when the music stopped, neither of them moved immediately away. The night ended without incident from Webb, which Peter did not trust. He was right not to trust it. The following Monday, Evelyn found a note under her door. She brought it to him immediately, which he appreciated. It was not signed, and it was brief. "Leave Harlow Creek by Wednesday, or the people you have spoken to here will find themselves involved in this in ways they did not choose." It was not a threat against her. It was a threat against the town. Peter put the note on his desk and stared at it for a long time. It was expertly calculated. Threatening Evelyn directly would not move her. Webb had assessed that correctly at the social. But Harlow Creek had become real to her in the 10 days she had been here. Tom Briggs was real. The Reverend's wife was real. The teacher and the children and the 40 women who baked competitively were all real to her now, and Webb knew it. "He is trying to use the town against you," Peter said. "Yes." "Will it work?" She met his eyes. "I cannot let harm come to people who have been kind to me because of a danger I brought here." "The danger," Peter said carefully, "was already here. Webb was already here before you arrived. The harm he has done to this territory and these people predates your arrival by 2 years. You are not the cause of the danger. You are the solution to it." She absorbed this. He watched her work through it, the precise logic of it, the way she tested its foundations for cracks. "There are 9 days until the marshal arrives," she said. 9 days. Can you keep the town safe for 9 days? "I have kept this town safe for 11 years, he said. "I am not going to stop now." Something in her expression changed. It was subtle, a softening, a lowering of that carefully maintained composure, just enough for him to see the exhaustion underneath it. 2 years of building a case. Months of being watched and followed. 10 days of being the most exposed person in a town full of strangers. She had been carrying this entirely alone, and something in his certainty seemed to reach her like a hand extended across dark water. "I believe you," she said quietly. He did something then that he had not planned. He reached across the desk and briefly covered her hand with his, not with any declaration or elaboration, just the simple contact of acknowledgement. "I see you, I am here, you are not alone in this." Then he withdrew it because the professional sensibility was still present even if it was getting thoroughly outcompeted. She looked at her hand for a moment. Then she looked at him. And what was in her face was something he had not seen there before, not the assessment or the practical intelligence or the controlled courage, but something personal and unguarded that he recognized from the inside because he was feeling it too. He cleared his throat. "I should increase the watch on Webb's men." "Yes," she agreed. "You should." Neither of them moved for another moment. Then they both did, at the same time, in opposite directions, with the mutual understanding of two people who have discovered something significant and are each giving the other the grace of not addressing it directly yet. The next several days were a chess match, and Peter had always been good at chess. He made himself highly visible in ways that were simultaneously professional and deliberate, appearing casually in the places Webb's watchers frequented, making it known by the simple fact of his presence that Harlow Creek had a sheriff who was paying attention. He also had several quiet conversations with men in the town whose judgment he trusted completely. Tom Briggs, the Reverend, a cattle rancher named Al Dowd who had been in the valley since before the Silver Rush and had a kind of bedrock reliability that had proven itself repeatedly. He told them enough to put them on alert without telling them everything, because the more people who knew the full details, the more vectors Webb had for obtaining information. He ate supper with Evelyn every evening. He told himself this was professional. He largely believed himself until the Thursday evening when they had been talking for 2 hours and looked up to find the dining room completely empty, the hour being much later than either had realized, and the lamplight being very warm, and her expression being so open and alive with what they had been discussing. She had been telling him about a trip she had taken with her father to San Francisco when she was 16. And her voice had taken on the quality of a person who is reliving something they love as they speak it, and he had looked at her and thought, with the crystal clarity of something that has been true for a while and has finally gotten tired of being unacknowledged, "I am in love with you." He said nothing of the kind. He escorted her back to the general store in the warm night with the stars doing their usual extravagant best above the high desert, and at the foot of the stairs she turned to say good night, and the space between them was very small, and he was aware of every inch of it. "Peter," she said. "Yes." She looked at him for a moment with something that was almost amusement and almost tenderness and altogether too much for him to manage composedly. "You are the most careful man I have ever met," she said. "Is that a criticism?" "No," she said. "It is an observation. I think you have been careful for so long that it has become its own kind of cage." He did not have an answer for that. He thought about it for a long time after he had walked home, and he thought it was the most accurate thing anyone had said about him in years. Friday morning, 4 days before the marshal was due, Webb made his actual move. It came through the forgery system, which Peter should have anticipated but had not because he had been thinking about it from the wrong angle. He had been watching for direct physical threat, for Webb's watchers to make a move against Evelyn or against him, or against the evidence in the locked compartment in the floor. He had not sufficiently watched the administrative machinery. On Friday morning, the owner of the Larkspur Hotel came to Peter's office with a piece of paper and a very troubled expression. The paper appeared to be a deed transfer, apparently executed the previous year, showing that the Larkspur and the building lot it occupied had been transferred to one of Webb's subsidiary companies. The signature at the bottom looked very much like Gerald Finch's signature, and Gerald Finch was the man standing in Peter's office with the troubled expression, and Gerald Finch was absolutely certain he had never signed it. Peter sat back in his chair and felt the full scope of what Webb was doing settle into clarity. Webb was not going to fight Evelyn's evidence with denials. He was going to drown it in noise. He was going to spend the remaining days before the marshal arrived manufacturing enough competing legal chaos in Harlow Creek, false deed transfers, fraudulent property claims, paperwork confusion, that the marshal would arrive to find not a clean investigation, but a nightmare of conflicting documentation that would take months to untangle. During those months, Webb could deploy his legal resources, his money, his connections in Carson City to delay and muddy and ultimately, perhaps, defeat the case. It was how he had beaten every other attempt to hold him accountable. Not through direct violence, but through institutional suffocation. Peter sent Evelyn a message to come to the office immediately, using a code phrase they had established for urgency. She arrived in 10 minutes and understood the situation in approximately 2. "He is going to flood the territory recorder's office," she said. "He already has a stock of fraudulent deeds prepared. He will file enough of them in the next 4 days to make the existing evidence look like a single thread in a tangle. Can you counter it? The originals, the genuine deeds, held by the actual property owners are the counter, but they have to be physically present and clearly documented." She was already thinking. He could see it, her mind moving through the problem with the speed of someone who had been living inside the intricacies of property law for 2 years. Every property owner in Harlow Creek needs to produce their original documentation today. Not tomorrow, today. "That is 50 families," Peter said. "Then we had better move quickly." They spent Friday working in a way that was so integrated and synchronized that Peter felt it like a physical phenomenon. The way 2 instruments in an orchestra will suddenly lock into a harmony that makes the air itself vibrate. He moved through the town with the authority of the sheriff, explaining to each property owner that there was reason to believe fraudulent transfers were being attempted, and that they needed to produce their deeds for immediate documentation. She moved with him, explaining the legal specifics to each person, the precise form of the threat, the precise remedy, in language that was clear and calm and completely credible. People trusted her. He had already seen this, but today it crystallized into something that moved him deeply. The way she spoke to Gerald Finch's wife with the same direct respect she spoke to Gerald Finch. The way she took time with old Ma Hartley, who was deaf in one ear and needed everything repeated. The way she explained to 3 separate farmers what a fraudulent deed transfer was, and why their original paperwork mattered without once being condescending or hurried. By evening, they had documentation from 43 of the 50 properties. The remaining 7 were either absent or on outlying land, and Henry Greer went out to reach them on horseback as the sun went down. Peter sent a telegram to the marshal's office in Carson City, using the coded language they had established, explaining the development and asking if the marshal could come sooner. The reply came 2 hours later. Earliest possible arrival now Sunday, not Wednesday. 3 days, not 4. He went to tell Evelyn. She was sitting on the steps outside the general store in the cool evening air, her shoes off, her feet in their stockings on the lower step, her hair slightly disheveled from a day of very fast movement through the town, and she had her head tipped back looking at the stars. She looked exhausted and purposeful and present in a way that hit him with the force of something he had been bracing against all week and had simply run out of energy to continue bracing against. He sat down on the step beside her. "The marshal comes Sunday," he said. She closed her eyes briefly in relief. "Good," she said. "Good." They sat in the night together. From somewhere in the town came the distant sound of someone playing a harmonica, something slow and minor key that suited the darkness exactly right. "After this," he said, and then stopped. She turned to look at him. She waited. "After this," he said again. "What do you do?" "I go back to Reno," she said. "I go back to work. I have a life there." "Do you?" he asked, and it was not meant to be unkind, but it was a real question. She was quiet for a moment. "I have things there," she said. "An apartment, a position. The land case has consumed 2 years, but there is work beyond the case." "There is also work here," he said. "There is always work here. The town does not stop needing." He could feel her looking at him in the dark. "Peter, I am not," he said carefully, "asking you to make a decision tonight. I am simply noting that Harlow Creek is a good town. I have been here 11 years, and I would not have stayed 11 years in a place that was not worth staying in." "And," she said, her voice low. "And the town is better when you are in it," he said. "That is all I am saying. The town is better, and I am better, and that is a simple fact that I think you deserve to have said to you plainly." The harmonica played its slow, minor song somewhere in the darkness, and Evelyn Norris sat on the steps of Tom Briggs's general store in Harlow Creek, Nevada, in the spring of 1883, and looked at Peter Malone with those gray eyes that had been cataloging him since the first morning, and she reached over and took his hand. Not briefly this time, not with the professional restraint of the office. She simply held his hand in the quiet of the evening, and he held hers back, and they sat like that for a long time without saying anything else, because some things do not need to be said aloud to be absolutely and permanently true. Saturday arrived with the specific tension of a day that is the last one before something definitive. Webb had not shown himself since the previous day's document gathering, which Peter interpreted correctly as a man regrouping. The fraudulent deeds had been a strategy, not a contingency. Webb had counted on the confusion they would create, and finding the entire town mobilized against them within hours had cost him something. The watchers were still in town, still at their posts, but they had the quality of men who are waiting for instruction and have not yet received it. Peter was at his office by first light. He reviewed everything, the original deeds now all present and accounted for and documented, the satchel of evidence still secure in the locked floor compartment, his deputy Henry at the eastern edge of town, watching the road from Carson City a day early. He sat with his coffee and his checklist, and the tight, controlled awareness that they were one day from the resolution of something that had cost Evelyn Norris 2 years of her life. She arrived at mid-morning, and he knew immediately from her face that she had slept, because for the first time in days she looked like a person who had been rested rather than a person who had been maintaining themselves on will and caffeine. "You look better," he said. "I had the best sleep of the last 2 years," she said. "I think it is because I know it is almost over." She sat across from him. "How do we get through today without Webb doing something catastrophic?" "By being better than catastrophic requires," Peter said. "We stay visible, we stay together, and we give him nothing he can use." He paused. "There is also the matter of his 2 watchers. I want to talk to them." "Talk to them," she repeated. "Separately, one at a time. I'm going to make it very clear to them what they are looking at in terms of their own legal situation if they carry out any instruction Webb gives them today. Some men choose the law over a paycheck when the choice is made explicit." She considered this. "And if they do not, then I will know exactly where they are and what they are prepared to do, which is better than not knowing." She nodded. "You are good at this," she said. "I have had 11 years of practice." "No," she said. "I do not mean the sheriff work. I mean the thinking of it, The way you see the whole board, she looked at him steadily. You are the best person I have met in a long time, Peter Malone. He was quiet for a moment. I am going to go talk to Webb's men, he said, which was not a deflection exactly, but was the closest he could manage to one while his sternum was doing the collapsing thing again. He spoke to the first watcher, a thin, tired-looking man named Collies, at 11 o'clock in the alley behind the livery. And Collies, when Peter laid out the precise legal consequences of continuing to operate in Harlow Creek on Webb's behalf in the context of an active territorial investigation, turned out to be entirely willing to get on his horse and ride south. He left within the hour. The second watcher was harder. He was called Trent, and he was the kind of man who had committed to a direction of life and was not easily redirected by legal consequences. He listened to Peter's presentation without expression and then said, "Webb pays better than the law does." "The law," Peter said, "is what happens when Webb's money runs out of people to buy, and that is happening now." He held Trent's eyes. "I am not telling you to leave because I cannot make you stay. I am telling you to leave because if you are in this town tomorrow, you will be in the middle of a territorial marshal's operation, and you will be found, and Webb will not spend a cent keeping you out of prison because you are not worth a cent to him after tomorrow." Something in Trent's face shifted. It was not conviction, exactly. It was arithmetic. He left on his horse before noon. Peter went back to the office and told Evelyn, and she gave him a look of genuine surprise. "You sent them both away," she said. "I offered them an alternative that was better than the one they had," he said. "That is all." She shook her head slowly. "You see the best option for everyone in every situation," she said. "You should be a judge." "I like it here," he said simply. Saturday passed. Webb stayed invisible, which was its own kind of alarm, and Peter kept his watch and did not relax for a moment. But the day closed without incident, and the town went about its Saturday with the ordinary beauty of a community that does not know how close it had come to being slowly dismantled. Sunday morning, before the church bell rang and before the stage road from Carson City had produced any dust cloud, Webb came to Peter's office one last time. He was not smooth this time. The surface was still there barely, but under it was something that had been calculated to coldness. "I want the woman out of my town by noon," he said. Peter looked at him. "It is not your town," he said. "It will be," Webb said. "This will not go the way you think it will. The territorial system is mine in ways you have never understood, and by the time any marshal gets here, there will be nothing left of that woman's case that holds up to scrutiny." "The deeds are documented," Peter said. "All 50 of them, the original signatures witnessed and recorded." Something moved behind Webb's face. "You have been busy." "I have," Peter said. 11 years of working for this town tends to produce a certain amount of goodwill, and goodwill turns out to be very useful when you ask 50 families to produce their paperwork in a single afternoon. He stood up from behind the desk, because the chair put him at a physical disadvantage, and he was done with disadvantages. "I am going to ask you to leave my office, Mr. Webb. And I am going to ask you to stay in Harlow Creek until the marshal arrives, because leaving now will look like exactly what it is." Webb looked at him for a long moment. The calculation was visible, just barely, a man totaling his options and finding them smaller than he had believed them to be. "You have no idea what you have started," he said. "I think," Peter said, "that you started it. I am finishing it." Webb left. Peter sat back down and realized his hands were steady. They had always been steady. Even with all of it, with the sleepless nights and the weight of 11 years and the presence of Evelyn Norris turning everything he had organized about his life into something requiring reorganization, his hands were still steady. He was still himself. Just a version of himself that knew something he had not known 2 weeks ago. The marshal arrived at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, which was earlier than Sunday and significantly earlier than Wednesday, and he came with 2 deputies and a territorial attorney, which told Peter that the office in Carson City had taken the telegram seriously. Marshal John Easley was a broad, unhurried man of 50 who had been working territorial law for 20 years and had the patient, immovable quality of something geological. He shook Peter's hand. He shook Evelyn's hand. He sat down with the satchel of evidence and the documented deeds and his attorney, and spent an hour and a half reading everything with the focused attention of a man who has learned to read documents the way a physician reads symptoms. Then he looked up and said, "This is enough." Evelyn sat very still, 2 years of enough in her eyes. "We will need you to remain available for testimony proceedings," Easley said to her. "That may take several months to complete." "Are you able to remain in the Nevada territory?" "Yes," she said, "then I can." Webb was taken into custody at 4 o'clock Sunday afternoon, on the main street of Harlow Creek, in the presence of half the town, which had gathered with the instinct that something significant was happening that they had a right to witness. He went with the territorial deputies without the dramatic resistance Peter had half expected, because by this point the calculation had been completed, and Webb was already thinking forward to his legal defense and the cooperation that might come with it. He was a cold man and a practical one, and he was beaten, and he knew it. Tom Briggs, standing next to Peter on the boardwalk as the deputies led Webb to the waiting horses, said quietly, "I knew something was off about that man from the first month he was here." "Why did you not say something?" Peter asked. "Because I am a general store owner and not a sheriff," Briggs said simply, and went back inside. Peter found Evelyn standing at the edge of the street, watching the dust settle after the deputies had ridden out with Webb. She was very still. Her hands were at her sides. The afternoon light was doing something extraordinary with the desert air, making everything golden and clean, and she looked like someone who has been in a long fight and has just felt it end. He went to stand beside her. She did not say anything for a long time. Then she said, "He is gone. He is gone." Another silence. He did not try to fill it. He understood that she needed to be inside this moment for as long as it required. "My father can rest now," she said finally, quietly, as if she were not entirely speaking to him. He put his hand at her back, gently, steady. She leaned barely, almost imperceptibly, into the steadiness of it. The town moved around them in the ordinary business of a Sunday afternoon in 1883. The people of Harlow Creek going about their lives with the particular ease of a community from which something malevolent had just been removed. And in the middle of it all, Peter Malone and Evelyn Norris stood together on the main street with the desert light on them, and the long fight ended, and the wide, uncertain, extraordinary question of what came next opening up in front of them. The days that followed had a quality Peter had never experienced before. The immediate tension had lifted, but Evelyn had not gone. The territorial attorney had asked her to stay accessible for the preliminary proceedings, which required her presence in Nevada for the foreseeable future, and she had agreed, and so the room above Tom Briggs's general store remained occupied, and the evenings continued. But they were different evenings now. The overlay of professional urgency had dissolved, and what remained underneath it was simpler and more complex at the same time. They were two people who had been thrown together by crisis, and had discovered, in the accelerated intimacy that crisis produces, something that crisis alone cannot explain. He took her riding on the Thursday after the arrest, out past the eastern edge of town, where the sage flats opened up into the wider valley, and you could see the mountains in the distance wearing their late winter snow like something ceremonial and old. She rode well, which he had not known until he saw it, with the easy competence of someone raised on a working ranch, and there was a freedom in her out here that he had not seen inside the town, something relaxed in her shoulders, something lighter in her expression. "This is what Reno used to be," she said, looking at the mountains. "Before all of it. It can be this again," he said. "The legal proceedings will be difficult, but they will end." She turned to look at him. They had stopped their horses on a slight rise, side by side, the desert spreading in every direction with its complicated, austere beauty. "You are always looking forward," she said. "Occupational habit," he said. "A sheriff who only looks backward is a sheriff who gets shot." She laughed. The laugh was genuine and full, Not the polite amusement of social obligation, but the real thing, surprised out of her. And it did to him what it always did, the struck bell, the vibration in the sternum. Except this time he did not look away and did not manufacture a distraction. He simply looked at her and let himself feel it. "I do not want to go back to Reno," she said, and the words came out with a directness that told him she had been holding them for a while and had decided to stop holding them. "I know," he said. "I do not know if that is because of you specifically or because of this place specifically," she continued, with the honesty that was so characteristic of her it had stopped surprising him. "And I think it is probably both. And I also think the distinction may be irrelevant because you are so thoroughly part of this place that I am not sure where one ends and the other begins." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the mountains, and then he said, "I asked the marshal on Sunday whether your formal testimony could be conducted here rather than in Carson City. He said it could be arranged, given that the preliminary documentation is substantial." She was looking at him. "When did you ask that?" "Sunday, while you were talking to his attorney. You were thinking about that with Webb being arrested 20 feet away." "I was thinking about it," he said carefully. "Yes." She shook her head, but the look on her face was not the cataloging assessment he had come to know. It was softer than that. "You are the most deliberately careful man in the Nevada Territory," she said. "It has been noted," he said. "Peter." "Evelyn." They looked at each other in the enormous silence of the open desert with the mountains watching from the distance, and he crossed the small space between their horses and took her face in his hands, steady as they always were, and kissed her with the directness of a man who has been careful for a long time and is done being careful about this particular thing. She kissed him back with the directness of a woman who had never been unclear about what she wanted, only careful about the timing of wanting it. When they separated, they stayed close, foreheads nearly touching, the horses patient around them, the sage smell rising in the afternoon warmth. "Stay," he said. "Yes," she said. It was not a complicated exchange. It was the simplest thing he had ever said and the most important answer he had ever received. They rode back to Harlow Creek in the late afternoon, with the sky going orange behind them and the town coming into view at the bottom of the valley. And Peter looked at it the way he had looked at it for 11 years, with the specific quality of care that a person has for a thing they have chosen and would choose again, and felt, for the first time in those 11 years, that what he was looking at was complete. The months that followed were busy and good in equal measure. The territorial proceedings against Clarence Webb were lengthy, and at times frustrating, as legal processes in the 1883 Nevada Territory were guaranteed to be. Webb had hired the most capable legal representation his considerable remaining resources could purchase, and the defense tried every avenue available to it, challenging the chain of custody on the fraudulent deeds, attempting to discredit the deceased land clerk's affidavit, arguing procedural violations in the documentation process. None of it worked. The reason it did not work was Evelyn. She was not simply a witness with a personal grievance. She was 2 years of meticulous, methodical, cross-reference documentation, and she presented it with a clarity and composure that systematically dismantled each defense strategy as it was introduced. Peter attended every session of the preliminary hearings that his duties in Harlow Creek permitted, sitting in the back of the courtroom in Carson City, and watching her work with an admiration so thorough it had become its own kind of happiness. The land clerk's testimony, delivered in written form before his death, proved central. Combined with the original deeds from the 50 Harlow Creek families, the forged documents Webb had attempted to file, and the 2 witness affidavits about the day of Robert Norris's death, the case built itself into something that had the density and permanence of stone. Clarence Webb was convicted in September of 1883 on 4 counts of land fraud and 1 count of conspiring to cause the death of Robert Norris. The conviction on the 5th count was the one that mattered most to Evelyn, and Peter, sitting in the back of the courtroom when the verdict was read, watched her receive it with her eyes closed for one long breath and then opened them, clear and steady, with the look of someone who has finished a very long journey and is now standing on solid ground. They had dinner that evening in Carson City, at a restaurant that was considerably finer than the Larkspur dining room, and he brought out the small box he had been carrying in his jacket pocket for 3 weeks and was frankly relieved to be done carrying. She looked at the ring, a simple gold band with a small garnet, chosen because he had noticed the garnet earrings she had worn to the Saturday social, and filed the information away in the manner of a person who is paying very close attention, and then she looked at him. "Peter Malone," she said. "Evelyn Norris," he said. "You have been planning this for 3 weeks," she said. "4," he admitted. She looked at the ring for another moment. Then she held out her hand, and he put the ring on her finger, and she leaned across the table and kissed him with the full, unhurried warmth of a woman who is not being strategic, and is not being careful, and is not doing anything except feeling exactly what she feels. "Yes," she said, which was the same word she had said in the desert and carried the same weight. They were married in November, in the church in Harlow Creek, where the Reverend had been quietly anticipating this event since approximately the 3rd week of Evelyn's arrival. It was a Thursday, which had been the day of their first real conversation over supper at the Larkspur, and this was a detail that Evelyn had insisted on and that Peter had noted was entirely impractical and had then agreed to immediately. The town came. All 460 souls of Harlow Creek, or as many as could fit into the church and the overflow out the door, because Harlow Creek took its own seriously, and Evelyn Norris had become Harlow Creek's own somewhere between helping Tom Briggs inventory bulk goods and organizing the documentation of 50 land deeds in a single afternoon. Tom Briggs wept during the ceremony, which he denied afterward with great vehemence. Henry Greer stood as best man and gave a toast at the celebration afterward that managed to be simultaneously very brief and very accurate, consisting primarily of the observation that he had never seen the sheriff walk into a wall, but that he had come close several times in the first week of Evelyn's arrival, which he felt spoke for itself. Evelyn moved from the room above the general store into Peter's house at the north end of town, and the house that had been correct for 1 became immediately and obviously correct for 2 in the way that some spaces are waiting for their actual configuration to be discovered. She found work that was both necessary and natural. The Territorial Land Claims Office in Carson City had been sufficiently impressed with her documentation work during the web proceedings to offer her a formal consulting position, which she conducted partly by correspondence and partly by quarterly trips to Carson City that Peter accompanied whenever his duties permitted. The remaining time she spent in Harlow Creek, which was a town with plenty of need for someone with her particular combination of legal literacy and human intelligence, and she filled that need with the quiet effectiveness that characterized everything she did. There was a case in the spring, a widow named Martha Lorne who had been told, imprecisely and somewhat dishonestly, by a distant cousin that her homestead claim had lapsed, that Evelyn resolved in 3 days through correct paperwork and a perfectly worded letter to the Territorial Recorder's office. Martha Lorne cried on her porch and offered her a pie, which became a standing arrangement that produced excellent pies on a quarterly basis. There was the school supply situation, which Evelyn had identified in her first week and had not forgotten. By the following autumn, the Harlow Creek schoolhouse had new textbooks, a proper globe, and enough chalk to last 2 years, funded through a combination of a charitable petition to the Carson City Education Board and contributions from the town's more prosperous members who had been persuaded to contribute by a conversation with Evelyn, that each of them privately described as making them feel that contributing had been their own idea. Peter watched all of this with the particular love of a person watching someone they love be fully themselves. He had been right on the very first morning when she had stepped off the stage and into the crossfire and said, with that absolute steadiness, "If you are going to shoot me, I would appreciate knowing why first." He had known, on some level he had not been able to access consciously yet, that this was someone extraordinary. Not in the abstract, decorated way, but in the practical, daily way that mattered more. Extraordinary in the way of a person who is exactly who they are completely, without performance or apology. He had kept order in Harlow Creek for 11 years, and she had disordered everything, and the disorganization had turned out to be the best thing that had ever happened to him. Their son was born in the autumn of 1884, on a Wednesday morning when the desert had done its extravagant October thing with the light, flooding the room with gold. They named him Robert, for her father, which was the only name either of them had seriously considered from the first conversation about it. And Robert Peter Malone arrived in the world with a very definite opinion about the experience that he communicated at volume until he was placed in Evelyn's arms, at which point he simply stopped, looked at her face with the dark gray eyes that were already recognizably hers, and went to sleep. Peter sat on the edge of the bed with his wife and his son in the October light, and felt the distinct and overwhelming sensation of a man who has arrived somewhere he did not know he was traveling toward but recognizes completely. "He looks like you," he said. "He has your nose," she said. "That is regrettable for him." She looked up at him with the expression that still did what it had always done to his sternum. "I love your nose," she said. "You are biased." "I am completely biased," she agreed, with no indication that this bothered her. Robert grew with the vigor and curiosity of someone with two extremely capable parents and a whole town invested in his development. He walked early and talked very soon after, and by 2 years old had established a particular affinity for Tom Briggs, who kept a jar of hard candy at the lower level of the counter, and was not very difficult to persuade on the question of sharing. The winters in Harlow Creek were cold, and the summers were hot, and the seasons between them were the kind of beautiful that makes a person understand why people choose difficult places to live. Peter still walked his rounds every morning and evening, and Evelyn still handled her correspondence at the kitchen table every morning before breakfast, and they ate supper together every evening, and the conversation never ran out. In 1886, a second child arrived, a daughter they named Clara, not for Peter's former love, but for Evelyn's maternal grandmother, and the coincidence of name was something Peter found privately right, as if his past and his present had agreed to share the same word as a form of resolution. Clara was louder than Robert from the beginning and more decisive, and had her father's dark hair and her mother's gray eyes in the exact inverse of Robert, and she had an opinion on everything from birth, and defended each opinion with a tenacity that made the Reverend, when told of it, remark that the town had better start preparing. The Reverend was not wrong. Peter turned 40 in the spring of 1889, and Evelyn organized the event with the same methodical thoroughness she brought to everything, which meant that 3/4 of Harlow Creek arrived at their house that evening, and Tom Briggs made a speech that was much longer than Henry Greer's wedding toast, but had a similar accuracy, and the fiddler from the southern pastures played until well past a reasonable hour. And Peter stood on his porch in the warm spring night surrounded by his town and his children, and the woman who had walked off a stagecoach 6 years ago, and taken his ordered life completely apart and rebuilt it into something he had not known to want, and he felt, with the certainty of someone who has spent a great deal of time in the presence of what is real and what is not, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Evelyn came to stand beside him when the crowd inside had grown self-sufficient, which is what happens at good parties after a certain hour, and she brought him a cup of the very good coffee that she made, and he always drank and leaned against the porch post looking out at the dark desert, with the stars making their extravagant display above them. 40, she said. "I am aware," he said. "You look the same as when I arrived," she said. "I am significantly more disordered," he said. She smiled, and he saw it in profile in the lamplight from the window, the full smile, the real one, the one that still struck him like a bell 6 years on. "I will take responsibility for the disorder," she said. "You should," he said. "It is entirely your fault." "And," she said. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into it with the ease of 6 years of practice. Out in the dark, Harlow Creek breathed its desert breath, and somewhere in the house Robert and Clara were asleep, and the fiddler was playing something slow and warm, and the stars over Nevada were doing what they always did, inexhaustible, extravagant, indifferent to everything except the fact of their own burning. "And I would not change a single day of it," he said. She turned and looked at him close in the lamplight with those gray eyes that had been the first thing that unmade him and were the thing that had remade him into everything he was now. "I know," she said. "Neither would I." He kissed her in the spring night on the porch of their house, and inside their children slept, and inside their town celebrated, and the Nevada desert stretched out in every direction with the quiet enormity that has never needed a human story to be significant, but occasionally becomes the setting for one that is entirely worth telling. Peter Malone had kept order in Harlow Creek for 11 years and had lost it completely the morning she arrived. He had spent every year since then discovering that what he had lost was not order at all. What he had lost was the cage he had built around himself and called by that name. The careful, solitary, efficient construction of a man who had decided that love and place could not coexist, and had chosen the place, and had been wrong in the most complete and fortunate way a person can be wrong. What she had given him, stepping off that stage and into the crossfire, and looking at him with those gray eyes without a tremor of fear, was the understanding that order and love are not enemies. That a man can hold a town together and be held together himself, that the steadiness in his hands and the disorder in his heart were both true at the same time, and that the truth of both of them, lived honestly and fully, was the whole of a human life. He held that understanding the way he held everything that mattered carefully, permanently, with both hands, for all the years that followed. The years that followed were long and full and good. Harlow Creek grew. The railroad came through in 1891, which changed the character of the town the way railroads changed everything, brought new people, new commerce, new complications that required the steady, patient attention of a sheriff who had 11 years of baseline and could see the change against it clearly. Peter navigated it the way he navigated everything, methodically, without panic, with the bedrock confidence of someone who knows his town because he has loved it for a long time. Evelyn's work with the Territorial Land Claims Office expanded as the population of Nevada expanded. She trained 2 younger women in Carson City in the documentation practices she had developed, and both of them went on to become significant figures in the territory's legal framework in ways that she was characteristically understated about. She had a habit of enabling other people's expertise and then declining credit for the enabling, which drove Peter quietly insane and which he pointed out to her regularly, and which she acknowledged and then continued doing. Robert, at 12, was a reader and a quiet observer of everything, with his mother's intelligence applied to the natural world rather than the human one. He knew every plant and rock formation in the surrounding valley with the thoroughness of a person who intends to understand the place he comes from. He also, Peter noted with a private satisfaction, had a sense of fairness that expressed itself as a willingness to stand between anyone being treated unjustly and the source of the injustice, which had already produced several schoolyard incidents, and which the teacher described as a problem, and which Peter described privately as the correct application of an instinct. Clara, at 10, was building what appeared to be a legal practice from her bedroom, in the sense that she had developed a reputation among the town's children for adjudicating disputes with a rigorous impartiality that several adults had privately found intimidating when applied to them in connection with boundary questions, fair turns at the well, and the ownership of strayed chickens. Evelyn watched this development with an expression that was entirely composed and the slightest bit smug. In the summer of 1892, a third child arrived, a boy they named Thomas, for Tom Briggs, who upon being informed of the honor cried again and again denied it with great vehemence. Thomas was a compact, cheerful child from the very beginning, with Peter's dark coloring and a temperament so even and sunny that Robert and Clara, who had each been notable for their intensity, found him simultaneously baffling and deeply restful. Tom Briggs visited so frequently in Thomas's first year that Evelyn eventually gave him a standing invitation to supper on Thursdays, which Briggs accepted with the dignity of a man who has been waiting for this invitation for several years and is not going to show how pleased he is. Henry Greer, who had married a woman from the Southern Valley in 1886 and was now the father of two and the closest thing to a second in command the Harlow Creek Sheriff's Office had produced, continued to demonstrate the same admirable talent for not asking unnecessary questions that had made him valuable from the beginning. He and Peter had developed the easy professional shorthand of two people who have worked together long enough to conduct half their communication through silence and the other half through very brief sentences. The Webb case concluded in its final appeal in 1889, 6 years after the original conviction, with the conviction sustained on all counts. The last piece of legal business connected to Robert Norris's ranch outside Reno was resolved the same year, the property restored to its proper chain of title, and what remained of it, the land itself, the sage-covered acres and the water table beneath them, was sold and the proceeds directed by Evelyn, with the precise, purposeful care she brought to everything important, to the Harlow Creek Schoolhouse, the Carson City Women's Legal Aid Fund she had helped establish, and a small grave marker in the Reno cemetery that now had on it, beside her father's name, a second line that read, "Sought justice, found it." Peter had driven her to Reno to see it placed. They had stood at the grave together in the autumn light, and she had been quiet for a long time, and then she had taken his hand the way she had taken it on the steps of the general store in that first terrible, beautiful week, and she had said, "He would have liked you." "I think I would have liked him," Peter said. She looked at him with those gray eyes, older now, with more in them than they had carried when she had first assessed him on Caldwell Street, but the essential quality unchanged, the intelligence, the steadiness, the particular warmth she directed at the things and people she had decided belonged to her. He belonged to her. He had known it since approximately the 5th evening at the Larkspur dining room, and being correct about it had turned out to be the most consistently wonderful thing about his life. "Take me home," she said. He took her home. Harlow Creek was waiting for them, as it always was lit up in the autumn evening, smoke from the chimneys going up straight in the still air, the lamp in Tom Briggs's store window burning late because Briggs was doing his quarterly inventory and refused help on principle, and took 3 times as long as he needed to, and was completely happy about it. The sound of Robert practicing something on the harmonica that Henry Greer had given him for his birthday, which was coming along slowly but determinedly. The lamp in Clara's bedroom window, which was always the last one out because she was always the last one to stop whatever she was doing and could not be argued into earlier. Peter stopped the wagon at the front of the house and helped Evelyn down, and she stood for a moment looking at the lit windows of their home the way he had taught her, not consciously, not by instruction, but by the long, slow transmission of shared life to look at the town, with the quality of recognition, with the knowledge that it is yours not because you own it but because you have given it your time and your care and your best years, and it has given them back to you multiplied. "It is a good town," she said. "It is a great town," he said. She leaned up and kissed him on the cheek in the dark, and then she went inside, and he stood for a moment longer looking at Harlow Creek in the autumn evening. His town, their town, the place he had been for 20 years now and would be for all the years remaining to him, and felt the fullness of it with the whole of his chest. Then he went inside too, into the warmth and the noise and the particular, irreplaceable ordinary of his life. The door closed behind him. The lamp in the window kept burning, and Harlow Creek, which had survived the Silver Rush and the drought in Clarence Webb and the coming of the railroad, and all the varied difficulties that the territory of Nevada could produce, continued on into the evening and the night and the long future of itself, ordered and loved, with a sheriff who had learned that both of those things could be true at the same time, and a woman who had known it all along.